Chapter 9: The Fiber Arts Revival. The Hippie Homesteaders and the Lanolin Dream. Consider the sheep. To the uninitiated observer, the sheep is a pastoral icon, a pristine, cloud-like entity peacefully grazing on a rolling green hillside. This is a profound and fundamental lie. The physical reality of the sheep is altogether different and far more deeply sensory. A sheep is a biological factory, a creature of dirt, sweat, and highly potent bodily fluids. A sheep is not a fluffy white cloud. It is a wildly messy, walking grease trap. Yet, to understand the modern fiber arts revival, one must first confront this messy, organic reality, because the entire history of knitting begins at the rear end of this rather pungent animal. Here in the timeline, the year is roughly 1970. The United States is in the throes of a massive cultural shift. The Back to the Land movement is sweeping the nation, drawing countless thousands of disillusioned urbanites out of the cities and into the deep rural pockets of the country. It is a visceral rebellion against mass consumerism, the military-industrial complex, and the suffocating perfection of machine-made plastic goods. This is not the first time humanity has fled to the woods. The concept was popularized in the early 20th century by activist Bolton Hall, who set up vacant lot farming in New York City, and by Ralph Borsodi, known for his experiments in self-sufficient living during the 1920s. There were echoes of it in Great Britain during the Dig for Victory campaign, and in the ideological framework of distributism. In the United States, pioneers like Scott and Helen Nearing had already established a mecca for self-reliance in Winhall, Vermont, publishing their famous 1954 book, Living the Good Life. But by the 1970s, the movement explodes. Young pioneers, often branded as hippies, are flocking to the hills and hollows of Appalachia, specifically West Virginia, and the rugged terrain of Vermont, seeking sanctuary from fast-paced urban life. In 1970, Lincoln County, West Virginia, becomes an early magnet for these newcomers, who stream into the state by the hundreds after an article appears in the Mother Earth News magazine advertising 79 acres of land for a mere $2,700. They buy cheap land, establish communes, and aim for total self-sufficiency. The cultural clash is immediate. At the 1975 Mountain State Folk Festival in Glenville, West Virginia, longtime attendees are absolutely scandalized not just by the sheer volume of new arrivals, but by the shocking sight of female festival attendees playing the fiddle. Self-sufficiency, however, is a harsh and demanding master. Rejecting the sterile, store-bought, synthetic sweaters of the mid-20th century means making clothing from scratch. And making clothing from scratch means someone has to literally wrestle a sheep. The sensory experience of a sheep shearing day on a 1970s commune defies modern, sanitized expectations. When a sheep is shorn, the resulting fleece is not ready to be spun into fine yarn. It is heavily permeated with suint, which is the technical term for sheep sweat, and it is laden with organic matter. The outermost edges of the fleece are crusted with dirt, flecks of straw, grass, and around the backside, things known as tags. Tags are exactly what they sound like, clods of wool hopelessly matted with feces, mud, and urine. The first step in processing raw wool is known as skirting, which involves meticulously picking through the pungent, oily fleece by hand to remove these nasty tags and vegetative matter. It is highly physical, profoundly unglamorous labor. And then there is the smell, the undeniable, inescapable, heavy scent of sheep. This odor comes directly from the animal's sebaceous glands, which secrete a waxy substance called lanolin. Lanolin coats the wool fibers, keeping the sheep reasonably waterproof and protecting it from carrying around pounds of soggy, rain-soaked wool. To be perfectly scientifically accurate, lanolin is not actually a fat, because it lacks glycerides, which are glycerol esters. It is primarily composed of sterol esters instead. A typical high-purity grade of lanolin is composed of roughly 97% long-chain waxy esters, with the remainder being lanolin alcohols, lanolin acids, and lanolin hydrocarbons. It is a chemical marvel, containing anywhere from 8,000 to 20,000 different types of lanolin esters. It melts at anywhere from 36 to 43 degrees Celsius, boasts a specific gravity of 0.935, and has the bizarre, highly useful physical property of being able to incorporate up to 30% of its own weight in water without separating. The history of lanolin is a strange and slightly gross medical tangent of its own. Humans have known about the magical, moisturizing properties of sheep grease for millennia. The ancient Greeks were the first to systematically extract crude wool fat, a process documented as early as 700 before the Common Era. The Greek physician Dioscorides, writing his Materia Medica in the 1st century, described a method of pouring hot wool washings into a receptacle and collecting the froth that gathered on top. He called this substance aesopus, a term that eventually made its way into numerous ancient medical texts and pharmacopoeias. The Roman author Pliny the Elder also praised the medicinal uses of sheep grease in his Natural History, recommending it for soothing irritated skin and healing wounds. Ancient medicine was remarkably resourceful and deeply unbothered by what modern society might consider repulsive. Consider the pharmacies of 16th century Europe, where one could find jars of aesopus, sitting right next to jars of ground-up human mummies. Egyptian mummies, initially prepared with bitumen, were ground into powder and consumed as medicine, the result of a massive historical misunderstanding regarding the healing properties of naturally occurring asphalt. Compared to ingesting a pulverized, jewel-encrusted Roman expat from an Egyptian tomb, rubbing raw sheep grease on a cracked knuckle seems rather quaint. It was not until the 19th century that a German named Otto Braun patented a method for centrifuging the liquid derived from wool washings, officially coining the term lanolin and ushering in modern, large-scale production. But on a back-to-the-land commune, lanolin was both a blessing and a curse. If a homesteader wanted to spin the fleece into yarn, the heavy grease and the sheep sweat had to be scoured or washed out of the wool. Some historically isolated peoples, like the inhabitants of Hog Island, deliberately spun their wool in the grease, letting their hands become coated and shiny with raw lanolin to retain the fiber's maximum weatherproofing capabilities. But for a clean, fluffy yarn, scouring was mandatory. This led to the great domestic nightmare of the fiber artist, the bathtub wash. Picture an ancient, clawfoot bathtub filled with scalding hot water and grease-cutting dish detergent. The homesteader plunges the dirty, skirted fleece into the water. Immediately, the house fills with the thick, cloying scent of melting lanolin and wet farm animal. A ram fleece is particularly notorious for its persistent, heavy odor. But here is the critical, unforgiving rule of washing raw wool: do not agitate the water. Heat, moisture, and friction are the 3 exact ingredients required for felting. If the aspiring spinner stirs the wool too vigorously, the microscopic scales on the keratin fibers will lock together like a biological zipper. In an instant, a beautiful, airy fleece will shrink and harden into an impenetrable, useless mat of solid felt. If the homesteader successfully navigated the scouring process without creating a felted disaster, the wool was dried, carded, and then spun on a spinning wheel. The resulting yarn was often lumpy, highly uneven, and still smelled faintly of the barnyard. Yet, sitting in a communal circle, spinning this raw material into usable thread was an act of profound defiance. It was a rejection of the alienated labor model of the 20th century. It was a way to reclaim the means of production, one greasy, lanolin-soaked handful of wool at a time. The bizarre economics of slow fashion. Why does a perfectly rational human being spend $200 on raw, ethically sourced wool and dedicate 80 hours of intensive physical labor to engineer a sweater they could easily buy at a big box store for $20? This is the great, bizarre economic paradox of the modern fiber arts revival. From a strictly financial and time management perspective, hand-knitting a garment makes absolutely no sense. Society currently exists in an era of unprecedented mass production, where global supply chains can deliver a finished, wearable garment to a consumer's doorstep for less than the cost of a mediocre lunch. And yet, the global knitting yarn market was valued at $6.5 billion in 2020, with the United States yarn market alone sitting at $1.8 billion in 2022. The average American knitter spends $300 annually just on yarn. In South Korea, the knitting apparel market sits at a staggering 3 trillion South Korean won, while European knitting machine markets boast valuations of 2.3 billion euros. To understand this absurdity, one must understand the hidden costs of cheap clothing and the psychological premium placed on slow fashion. The fast fashion business model is entirely built upon extreme speed and massive scale. Brands operate on tight schedules, turning runway trends into affordable garments within weeks. The traditional 4 seasons of the fashion calendar have been obliterated. Today, megacorporations push 52 microseasons a year, creating a new collection every single week. To keep the sticker price at $10 or $20, these companies heavily outsource production to developing countries, taking brutal advantage of cheaper labor costs and lax regulatory oversight. The human toll is staggering. Investigations into some of the largest global fast fashion brands, valued at $100 billion, have uncovered factory workers laboring for 18 hours a day. These individuals receive just 1 day off per month, earning either a $556 monthly salary or a commission of a mere 4 cents per item of clothing. 4 cents is the human cost exchanged for a trendy $10 pair of pants. Many of these workers routinely exceed 120 hours of labor per week, far beyond the 80-hour threshold linked to severe cardiovascular disease, mental illness, and addiction. The $20 sweater is not magically cheap. Its true cost is simply externalized, paid for in the currency of human suffering and severe environmental degradation. The slow fashion movement, embodied by the hand knitter, confronts this reality by completely reversing the equation. The knitter assumes the cost of the labor themselves. When a knitter buys a sweater quantity of yarn from an independent, hand-dyeing artisan, they might easily spend $150 to $200 on the raw materials alone. Unabashed yarn snobs, a self-proclaimed and highly vocal demographic within the community, routinely budget $100 to $150 per garment to secure unique, luxurious fibers. But this cost is amortized over the intense joy of the process. If a complex, mathematically intricate cabled sweater takes 9 months and 80 hours of physical labor to knit, the financial output spread across those months drops to roughly $16 a month. The knitter is not merely purchasing a piece of clothing. They are buying hundreds of hours of entertainment, a complex cognitive challenge, and the deep, abiding psychological satisfaction of escaping the hyperconsumerist cycle. However, if $200 for sheep's wool seems steep, the economics of slow fashion can become far more extreme. Enter the rarefied world of ultra-luxury fibers, where the pursuit of warmth, rarity, and softness reaches absurd financial heights. Consider the vicuna, Roman sixgunia. The vicuna, Roman sixgunia, is a small, wild camelid native to the high alpine areas of the Andes in South America. It produces what is definitively the most expensive wool on Earth. The fiber is incredibly fine, measuring a minuscule 8 to 14 microns in diameter. Because vicunas, Roman sixgunias, are wild, highly protected, and produce very little fleece, harvesting their wool is a monumental logistical and legal task. Raw vicuna, Roman sixgunia, fleece costs between $400 and $600 per kilogram. By the time it is painstakingly processed into finished yarn, vicuna, Roman sixgunia, commands the staggering price of $10,690 per kilogram. A single, commercially produced vicuna, Roman sixgunia, sweater can easily retail for $4,000 to $9,000, while a full coat can reach an eye-watering $31,000. Or consider kiviut, kiviut. Kiviut, kiviut is the downy underwool produced by the Arctic muskox. These massive, shaggy relics of the last ice age survive the brutal polar night by growing a highly specialized, insulating layer of fine fiber beneath an outer coat of long, coarse guard hairs. The thermal properties of kiviyut are legendary. It is reputed to be 8 times warmer than regular sheep's wool, so insulating that snow can rest on the back of a muskox without melting. Harvesting kiviyut, is an exercise in extreme patience and agricultural bravery. One does not simply walk up to a prehistoric beast with a set of electric clippers. In fact, when an attempt was made to shear a young muskox at the Bronx Zoo in 1910, the animal tragically died of pneumonia shortly afterward. Muskoxen undergo a highly synchronous shedding process every spring, where the kiviyut, lifts away from the animal's skin like a thick blanket over a brief 2-week period. In the wild, it hangs in ragged tatters and catches on tundra brush. Attempts to domesticate these beasts have a fraught history. In 1930, the United States Biological Survey spent $40,000 to acquire 33 muskoxen from eastern Greenland, shipping them to College, Alaska. The experiment was a disaster. Housed in a boreal forest clearing, the animals broke out of their inadequate fencing, and hungry bears broke in, killing several of them. The survivors were relocated to the open tundra of Nunivak Island in 1935, where they finally thrived. Today, at places like the Large Animal Research Station at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, handlers must carefully maneuver the massive, rutting, horned bulls into a squeeze chute, a heavy metal animal restraint system. Once secured, the soft undercoat is meticulously combed out by hand. Because of the intense labor and the rarity of the animal, pure kiviyut yarn is fiercely expensive, routinely selling for $108 for just over 200 yards, breaking down to roughly $90 an ounce. When a fiber artist purchases a skein of kiviyut, or high-grade vicuna, Roman 6 gunya, they are engaging in a form of economic devotion. They are prioritizing the tactile, the sustainable, and the incredibly rare over the immediate and disposable. The resulting sweater becomes an investment, a bespoke engineered garment designed to last a lifetime, standing in stark, obstinate contrast to the dark reality of what happens when cheap fashion is inevitably thrown away. The landfill versus the heirloom. What exactly happens when a neon pink, synthetic Christmas sweater dies? To answer this question, one must look closely at the bodily and environmental reality of modern fast fashion. The vast majority of cheap clothing produced today is manufactured from synthetic fibers, predominantly polyester, nylon, and acrylic. These materials are not woven from the hair of an animal or the cellulose of a plant. They are, fundamentally, plastics derived from fossil fuels. And plastics possess a fatal flaw when it comes to the life cycle of a garment. They do not simply go away. The environmental disaster of fast fashion begins long before the garment reaches the trash can. It begins in the seemingly innocent environment of the domestic washing machine. Every time a consumer washes a polyester or acrylic sweater, the mechanical friction and water agitation cause the fabric to shed microscopic plastic fragments. Scientific studies have demonstrated that a single, typical 5-kilogram wash load of polyester fabrics can release an astonishing 6 million microplastic fibers into the wastewater system. Other estimates suggest that a single wash cycle can release up to 700,000 plastic fibers. Municipal water treatment plants are generally incapable of filtering out particles this minuscule. Consequently, these microplastics flow directly into rivers, lakes, and oceans. Washing machines are now responsible for 35% of all global microplastic pollution. These particles are ingested by marine life, working their way up the food chain until they land directly on human dinner plates. These microscopic synthetic threads have been detected in tap water, human blood, breast milk, and even the placenta. It is a silent, pervasive contamination. As researchers have ominously noted, all synthetic clothing will eventually become microplastics. It is simply a time-delayed pollution bomb. And ironically, Textiles manufactured from recycled plastics, such as recycled polyester, often emit more microplastics than virgin polyester, exacerbating the crisis. But the horror of the synthetic sweater reaches its visceral apex at the end of its life. Because fast fashion pushes consumers to view clothing as entirely disposable, global textile waste has reached apocalyptic proportions. Worldwide, an estimated 80 billion pieces of clothing are consumed every year, representing a 400% increase from just 20 years ago. Approximately 85% of these textiles end up in a landfill. To witness the physical manifestation of this crisis, one must travel to the Atacama Desert in northern Chile. The Atacama is the driest non-polar desert in the world, a Martian landscape of arid rock and sand. Today, however, massive new dunes are forming in the desert, but they are not made of sand. They are mountains of discarded clothing. Chile has long been a hub for second-hand and unsold clothing, importing goods manufactured in China or Bangladesh that have passed through retail stores in Europe, Asia, and the United States. Every year, some 59,000 tons of clothing arrive at the Iquique port in the Alto Hospicio free zone. While some of this is resold and smuggled across Latin America, at least 39,000 tons of it cannot be sold. Because this clothing is largely synthetic, it is not biodegradable. Because it is packed with toxic chemical dyes, heavy metals, azo dyes, and phthalates, municipal landfills refuse to accept it. With nowhere else to go, and with no one willing to pay the tariffs to properly dispose of the waste, fleets of trucks haul the unwanted garments out into the vast, unregulated expanse of the Atacama, and simply dump them. The visual is staggering, so immense that the massive piles of dumped clothing are visible from space. Immense, towering dunes of brightly colored textile waste stretch across the desert floor. Discarded ski boots, neon party dresses, and unwanted Christmas sweaters bake under the harsh Chilean sun. The arid climate prevents any natural breakdown of whatever organic materials might be present, while the synthetic bulk of the piles simply sits there, leaching toxins into the soil. Occasionally, these massive piles catch fire or are intentionally burned, creating a disaster zone that local activists compare to a war. These infernos send thick, black plumes of toxic smoke into the atmosphere, poisoning the air for local communities. Activists like Angela Angela Astudillo, and her youth collective Desierto Vestido, alongside professors like Barbara Pino from the Fashion System Observatory, fight tirelessly to expose this crisis. Meanwhile, entrepreneurs like Franklin Zepeda, have founded companies like Ecofibra, in a desperate attempt to turn this toxic waste into building insulation. It is a monument to human waste, a graveyard of micro-trends and abandoned shopping carts. Contrast this apocalyptic wasteland with the ultimate goal of the slow fashion movement, the heirloom garment. When a fiber artist spends months knitting a sweater out of 100% natural wool, they are creating a fundamentally different class of object. Wool is a biological marvel. It evolved over millions of years to protect wild sheep from extreme conditions. Clean wool fiber contains a massive amount of keratin, representing 82% of the proteins that make up the fiber. Keratin is exactly the same structural material as human hair and fingernails. Complete hydrolysis of wool produces a complex mixture of 18 vital amino acids, including glycine, alanine, phenylalanine, valine, leucine, isoleucine, tryptophan, proline, serine, threonine, tyrosine, methionine, cysteine, arginine, lysine, histidine, aspartic acid, and glutamic acid. Because it is an organic, naturally occurring substance constructed of complex proteins, wool is highly biodegradable. When placed in the soil, or even in marine environments, wool does not break down into toxic microplastics. Instead, it becomes a food source. A host of soil-dwelling fungi and microorganisms rapidly colonize the keratin, consuming the fibers and returning their nutrients directly to the earth. Furthermore, wool requires far less laundering than synthetic fabrics. It is naturally odor-resistant and highly breathable, meaning a wool sweater can often go an entire season with nothing more than an occasional airing out on a clothesline. When a hand-knit wool sweater eventually wears out, decades after it was carefully crafted, it will not languish in a desert dump for centuries. It can literally be thrown into a garden compost bin, where it will safely and quietly dissolve back into the carbon cycle. The modern fiber artist treats their craft not just as a hobby, but as an environmental imperative. The hand-knit garment is an organic, biodegradable heirloom, standing in quiet, defiant contrast to the toxic mountains of the Atacama. The mother of all databases. How exactly does a community transition from the extremely physical, messy reality of raw wool, sheep grease, and tedious manual labor into the sterile, highly organized, hyper-connected world of the internet? The answer lies in the sheer volume of data inherent to the craft of knitting. Knitting is, at its absolute core, a highly mathematical pursuit. It is the binary coding of the physical world. A knitter works with infinite sequences of knits and purls, increasing and decreasing stitch counts, calculating complex yardages, and measuring the precise diameter of yarn wraps per inch. It is a highly technical art form begging to be quantified, structured, and cataloged. And cataloged it was. In the early 2000s, a revolution occurred that dragged the ancient craft of knitting directly into the digital age. This revolution was not a new type of spinning wheel or a faster, more efficient mechanized loom. It was a database. To the casual observer, the website Ravelry is simply a cozy social network for crafters to share pictures of their scarves. To a software engineer or a data scientist, however, it is a serious technological marvel. It is arguably one of the most highly structured, cleanly queried, and exhaustively maintained relational databases on the entire internet. The story begins in the spring of 2005, when a knitter named Jess and a programmer named Cassidy conceived of an online community that would function as a comprehensive encyclopedia of knitting patterns and yarn. By the spring of 2007, they had built a functioning prototype, and during the Maryland Sheep and Wool Festival that May, they began sending out beta invitations. The growth was explosive. By the end of 2007, over 55,000 people were actively using the site. Millions of isolated grandmothers, urban punks, and casual hobbyists suddenly had a centralized hub to log their projects. But what they were actually doing, largely by accident, was crowdsourcing a massive, open-source data analytics project. To fully appreciate the scale of this achievement, one must view Ravelry through a strict data analysis lens. In computer science, choosing the correct database architecture is paramount to a platform's survival. In the early days of web scalability, the great debate raged between SQL and NoSQL databases. While tech giants were moving towards schemaless NoSQL databases like Cassandra at Twitter or Project Voldemort at LinkedIn to handle massive scale, Ravelry took a traditional route. It was built as a classic CRUD application, an acronym standing for Create, Read, Update, and Delete. It utilized a Ruby on Rails framework connected to a highly structured MySQL relational database. A relational database organizes data into interconnected tables consisting of strict rows and columns, with predefined schemas that enforce absolute data integrity. They follow strict rules known as ACID compliance, standing for atomicity, consistency, isolation, and durability, ensuring reliable, error-free transactions. Every piece of information must fit into a specific, logical category. When a user uploads a new knitting pattern to Ravelry, they do not simply post a picture and a brief description. They populate a meticulously designed data matrix. They input the precise yardage required, the exact gauge, which is the mathematical calculation of how many stitches fit into a 4-inch square, the needle size in both metric and US standard, the yarn weight category ranging from thread-like lace to super bulky, and the specific fiber content. The users themselves became an army of voluntary, highly dedicated data entry clerks, constantly cross-referencing their personal projects with the master database. If a yarn company releases a new blend of merino wool and silk, a user will log it into their digital stash. Other users can then query that specific yarn to see how it performs in real life. They can pull up photographs of exactly how that specific dye lot looks when worked into a cable pattern by a knitter in a completely different hemisphere. It is an open-source data ecosystem that rivals the cataloging efforts of major technology corporations. The resulting statistics are staggering. By 2022, the Ravelry database housed nearly 1.2 million distinct patterns. In that year alone, the massive user base knit over 328 million yards of yarn, the equivalent of wrapping a string around the earth multiple times. The community added over 8 million photos across pattern, yarn, project, and stash pages. The database handles 10 million daily requests with exceptional speed and scalability, almost entirely because of its rigid adherence to a faceted classification system. Faceted classification is a system that allows an item to be assigned multiple, independent attributes or tags, enabling users to explore the collection by applying multiple filters simultaneously through a Boolean logic search. The advanced search function on Ravelry is a thing of absolute, breathtaking beauty to data nerds. A user does not simply type the word sweater into a search bar. They execute a highly complex query, utilizing 239 distinct filter options. They can command the database to return all cardigan patterns, knitted in the round, using a fingering weight yarn, featuring a V-neck and a top-down construction that are available as a free digital download, and that have been successfully rated by at least 50 other users. Because knitting is an inherently creative and occasionally eccentric hobby, the database schema must account for every possible variation of human imagination. This has resulted in a wildly expansive and weirdly specific list of design element attributes. If one dives deep into the advanced search filters, past the standard tags for lace, cables, and baubles, they enter the bizarre, highly specialized fringes of the fiber arts. Ravelry allows users to explicitly search for patterns tagged with the attribute taxidermy. Yes, if one wishes to knit a hyper-realistic, life-sized replica of a woodland creature to mount on a living room wall, the relational database has a query parameter specifically for that. There is also a dedicated tag for anatomically correct. Should a science teacher need a pattern for a biologically accurate, knit human heart complete with aortas and ventricles, the database will instantly fetch it from the millions of entries, neatly bypassing the mountains of baby booties and tea cozies. The categorization system is so intense that users often debate the philosophical implications of the metadata. For instance, male knitters have noted the frustration of searching for men's garments using the gender tag, only to find the results cluttered with lace crop tops that simply applied the male tag to gain visibility. The elegant solution offered by the database architecture is to bypass the flawed human application of gender entirely and simply rely on the strict, unfeeling logic of design elements. A user can filter out peplums, scallops, cap sleeves, and cropped lengths, utilizing the raw power of negative search attributes to mathematically isolate the exact structural garment they desire. This is the brilliant, beautiful contradiction of the modern fiber arts revival. It is a movement deeply anchored in the most primitive of human technologies. It relies on sheep grazing in fields, on the pungent, greasy reality of lanolin, and on the highly physical, repetitive motion of hands manipulating raw fiber. It is a slow, methodical rejection of the fast fashion industrial complex, pushing back against the 18-hour factory shifts and the toxic, burning, overflowing landfills of the Atacama. Yet, to preserve, catalog, and expand this ancient craft, its practitioners accidentally built one of the most sophisticated, mathematically precise, and exhaustively structured digital architectures on the web. They took the messy, organic reality of the natural world and mapped it flawlessly into the pristine, organized logic of a relational database. The revival of knitting is not merely a retreat into the past or a nostalgic longing for a simpler time. It is an intricate, highly engineered bridge between the tactical, survivalist skills of human history, and the massive, unparalleled data processing capabilities of the modern era. And it all starts with a little bit of sheep grease.